The family that makes the world's sweetest candy has a bitter history. Products that represent childhood joy are said to have been created from the pain of other children. They are one of the richest and most powerful families on the planet, but they live almost invisible to the public. This is the story of the Mars family. So, what dark secrets lie behind the world's most powerful candy empire? The man who founded the Mars family was Franklin Clarence Mars. He was born in Minnesota in 1883, a time when America was changing rapidly. It was a world of contrasts. While industrialists like Rockefeller and Carnegie were building steel and oil empires, most people still lived a hard, agrarian life. But Frank's destiny wasn't shaped by the farm fields, but by a childhood illness that left him homebound for years. The illness confined him to his home, stealing his normal childhood. It was in that confinement that his mother, Elva, taught him the only way to bring sweetness into his life, by handcrafting chocolates in their kitchen. She didn't just teach him a trade, she gave him a passion, a way to create joy out of adversity. Those lessons in that simple kitchen laid the foundation for the billion-dollar empire to come. Frank's early adult life was a testament to his dogged persistence, a long and often frustrating apprenticeship, marked by a series of false starts and crushing failures. His ambition was clear, but the path to success was anything but. His first foray into the business world was not as a confectioner, but as a wholesaler of snacks. He roamed the territories of Minnesota, selling chips and other goods to local taverns. It was a grueling, unglamorous job that offered little more than a meager living. During this time, he married his first wife, Ethel G. Kissack, a school teacher who brought a sense of stability and intellectual rigor to his life. In 1904, their only son, Forrest Edward Mars, was born. The arrival of Forrest should have been a moment of pure joy, but it also added a new layer of pressure. Frank was no longer just a struggling salesman. He was a father, a provider, with a family to support. The weight of this responsibility, coupled with his relentless ambition, pushed him to take his first real gamble. He decided to leave the transient life of a traveling salesman behind and establish his own candy-making business. He had the skills his mother had taught him, a deep-seated passion for confectionery, and a burning desire to build something of his own. But desire alone does not guarantee success. His initial ventures were plagued by a combination of bad luck, insufficient capital, and perhaps a touch of naivety. Years later, in 1920, he would found the Morrow Bar Company in Minneapolis, a turning point that marked his first real success. The name itself, a clever play on his own, hinted at the personal nature of his dream. But the company faltered, unable to compete with more established players in the market. He tried again and again, each time pouring his heart and his meager savings into a new venture, only to see it collapse. The strain of these repeated failures took a heavy toll, not just on his finances, but on his marriage. The constant stress, the long hours, and the ever-present shadow of debt eroded the foundations of his relationship with Ethel G. She had married a man with dreams, but the reality was a life of instability and disappointment. Their marriage crumbled under the pressure, and they divorced. Forrest, still a young boy, was caught in the middle. His father, now a two-time failure in both business and marriage, seemed a distant, almost tragic figure. Ethel G. eventually remarried and raised Forrest, instilling in him a fierce sense of discipline and an almost obsessive work ethic, perhaps as a direct response to the perceived instability of his biological father. Forrest would later recall his childhood with a certain coldness, viewing his father's early struggles not as a noble effort, but as a sign of incompetence. This fractured relationship, born from the ashes of Frank's early failures, would fester for decades, creating a psychological chasm between father and son that would define the future of the Mars dynasty. By 1911, Frank Mars was a man adrift. He had lost his business, his wife, and, for all practical purposes, his son. At the age of 28, he found himself in Tacoma, Washington, a city on the edge of the continent, a place where a man could get a fresh start or disappear completely. It was here, at his lowest point, that he decided to return to his roots. He had no factory, no investors, no grand business plan. He had only the skill his mother had given him and a resilience forged in the crucible of failure. He began once again to make candy. From the humble kitchen of his Tacoma boarding house, he started selling buttercream candies. He would cook the confections at night and sell them door to door the next day. It was a small, almost desperate operation, but it was honest work. It was a business built from the ground up, one customer at a time. It was during this period of quiet rebuilding that he met Ethel V. Healy, a woman who would become not just his second wife, but his most crucial business partner. Ethel V. was a force of nature, practical, sharp, and fiercely loyal. Where Frank was the dreamer and the craftsman, she was the anchor, the one who managed the books, ran the storefront, and provided the steady hand that had been so desperately missing from his earlier ventures. Together, they were a formidable team. She saw the potential in Frank that others, including his own son, had failed to recognize. She believed in his dream, and her belief gave him the confidence to try again on a larger scale. They married and, pooling their resources, officially founded Mars Incorporated. The business was still small, a local candy shop in a rented building, but it was solvent. For the first time in his life, Frank Mars wasn't just surviving, he was succeeding. This small taste of stability, however, only whetted his appetite for something greater. He knew that to build a real empire, he had to leave the relative obscurity of Tacoma and return to the heart of the country, to the place where his journey had begun, Minnesota. The return to Minnesota in 1920 was a symbolic and strategic masterstroke. Frank Mars, once a failed candy maker from Minneapolis, came back a different man. He was older, wiser, and accompanied by a partner who complemented his skills perfectly. He was no longer just a dreamer. He was a proven businessman, albeit on a small scale. He set up a new factory in Minneapolis, a city that had once been the site of his deepest professional humiliations. It was a bold declaration that he was no longer running from his past. This was also the moment when his estranged son, Forrest, re-entered his life. Forrest, now a sharp and ambitious young man forged in the disciplined household of his mother and stepfather, was a student at the University of California, Berkeley. During his summer breaks, he would work at his father's new factory. The reunion was fraught with tension. Forrest looked at his father's operation with a critical, almost disdainful eye. He saw inefficiency, a lack of quality control, and a failure to think on a grander scale. He would openly challenge his father's methods, creating a palpable friction on the factory floor. He saw potential, but he also saw what he considered to be a profound lack of vision. The flashpoint, the moment that would transform Mars Inc. from a regional candy maker into a national powerhouse, came in 1923. The story has become a cornerstone of the Mars family lore. Frank and Forrest were at a local soda fountain, a common social hub in the 1920s. Forrest was enjoying a malted milkshake, a popular concoction of ice cream, milk, syrup, and malt powder. Turning to his father, he posed a simple yet revolutionary question. "Why don't you put this chocolate malted drink in a candy bar?" It was a spark of genius. Frank, with his confectioner's intuition, immediately understood the appeal. The flavors of a malted milkshake were beloved by Americans, but they were ephemeral, confined to a glass and a straw. To capture that experience in a solid, shelf-stable candy bar would be a masterstroke. The idea ignited a frenzy of experimentation back at the factory. The challenge was to create a nougat that was light, fluffy, and redolent of malt, a significant departure from the dense, chewy nougats common at the time. After countless trials, they perfected the recipe, a soft, malt-flavored nougat, topped with a layer of creamy caramel, all enrobed in rich milk chocolate. They called it the Milky Way. The success of the Milky Way bar was instantaneous and overwhelming. It was unlike anything else on the market. It was an affordable luxury, a taste of the soda fountain that could be enjoyed anywhere, anytime. Sales exploded. The Minneapolis factory, which had seemed so ambitious just a few years earlier, was suddenly struggling to keep up with the demand. Frank Mars had finally found his signature creation, the product that would make his name synonymous with American confectionery. The profits poured in, allowing him to expand his operations, hire hundreds of employees, and move the company to a massive new facility in Chicago, the nation's transportation and candy-making hub. The newfound wealth transformed Frank's life. The boy who had been confined to a small Minnesota house by polio now lived a life of unimaginable opulence. He bought a sprawling 2,800-acre estate in Pulaski, Tennessee, which he named Milky Way Farms. It was a monument to his success, a lavish world of rolling hills, pristine stables, and a 25,000-square-foot manor. He poured his passion into breeding thoroughbred horses, a hobby of kings and aristocrats. In 1940, 6 years after Frank's death, his widow Ethel Mars saw one of their prized horses, Galahadian, win the Kentucky Derby. Frank C. Mars, the humble candy maker, had reached the pinnacle of high society. But this glittering success story concealed a deepening rot at its core, the relationship between Frank and Forrest. Forrest, despite having provided the initial spark for the Milky Way, felt marginalized. He believed his father and stepmother Ethel Vey were squandering the company's profits on a lavish lifestyle instead of reinvesting in the business. He pushed for global expansion, for higher standards of quality, for a more disciplined, long-term vision. Frank, basking in his hard-won success, saw his son's relentless criticism not as constructive advice, but as a personal attack, a constant reminder of his own past failures. The tension between the cautious, self-made founder and the aggressive, university-educated heir was becoming unbearable. The stage was set for a conflict that would tear the family and the company apart. The air in the opulent Chicago offices of Mars, incorporated during the early 1930s, was thick with a strange mixture of success and simmering resentment. On the surface, it was a golden age. The Milky Way bar, a product of inspired genius, had become a national phenomenon, a 5-cent escape for a country grappling with the grim realities of the Great Depression. The company was a financial juggernaut, and its founder, Frank C. Mars, was living a life that would have been unimaginable to the polio-stricken boy in the small Minnesota kitchen. He was a titan of industry, a Kentucky Derby-winning horse breeder, the master of a sprawling Tennessee estate. He had, by every conceivable measure, achieved the American dream. But within the walls of his own family, a bitter civil war was brewing, a conflict of ideologies and personalities so profound it threatened to shatter the very empire he had built. At the heart of this conflict was his son, Forrest. To the outside world, Forrest was the heir apparent, a brilliant young man with degrees from Berkeley and Yale, poised to inherit a confectionery kingdom. But to his father, he was a constant grating presence, a walking, talking embodiment of his own insecurities. Forrest was everything Frank was not. Where Frank was intuitive and driven by a craftsman's passion, Forrest was analytical, methodical, and armed with the latest theories of business management. Where Frank saw profits as a reward to be enjoyed, a means to a life of comfort and luxury, Forrest saw capital as a weapon to be reinvested, a tool for relentless expansion in the pursuit of perfection. Forrest roamed the factory floors not as a proud son, but as a relentless critic. He saw waste in every corner, inefficiency in every process. He would berate workers for minor infractions, challenge his father's purchasing decisions, and openly mock the lavish spending on Milky Way farms. He called the estate a monument to stupidity, a black hole sucking up money that could be used to modernize equipment or explore new markets. He argued that the company's reliance on the American market was myopic. He saw a world of untapped potential in Europe and beyond, a global empire waiting to be conquered. To Forrest, his father wasn't a visionary. He was a provincial candy maker who had stumbled upon one great idea and was now content to rest on his laurels. For Frank, these criticisms were like daggers to the heart. He saw in his son's ruthless ambition a chilling lack of gratitude. Had he not built this company from nothing, surviving bankruptcy and personal ruin? Did Forrest not understand the years of struggle, the door-to-door sales, the nights spent perfecting recipes in a boarding house kitchen? He saw his son's Ivy League arrogance as a dismissal of his own hard-won wisdom. The conflict was Oedipal in its intensity. The son, armed with new knowledge, sought to overthrow the father, whom he viewed as obsolete. The father, clinging to the success that had validated his entire life, saw the son as a threat to his authority and his legacy. The final explosive confrontation came in 1932. The details remain shrouded in the family's characteristic secrecy, but the outlines are clear. It was a ferocious argument, a culmination of years of unspoken resentment. Forrest, in a move of breathtaking audacity, demanded a third of the company. He felt he was entitled to it, not just as Frank's son, but as the intellectual engine he believed was essential for the company's future. Frank was incandescent with rage. The demand was the ultimate betrayal. In his eyes, Forrest had contributed little more than a stray idea at a soda fountain and years of incessant criticism. In a fit of fury, Frank essentially banished him. "You're not getting a third of this company," he roared. "Go start your own damn business if you think you're so smart." It was a bluff, a father's angry dismissal of a petulant son, but Forrest called it. He agreed to leave, but not empty-handed. In a hastily arranged settlement, Frank allowed his son to take the Milky Way recipe overseas, giving him the rights to sell it beyond America's borders. It was a way of pushing him out of the nest, of sending him as far away as possible. Let him try to conquer the world. Frank would keep the lucrative American market for himself. He likely never imagined that this act of exile would create a rival empire, one that would eventually return to consume his own. And so Forrest Mars Sr., with a small fortune in his pocket and a recipe for his father's greatest creation, turned his back on America and set sail for England, a revolutionary in exile. Forrest arrived in a Great Britain that was a world away from the booming confidence of his father's Chicago. It was a nation mired in economic stagnation, its old imperial grandeur beginning to fade, a place where tradition often trumped innovation. The British palate was different, the business culture more formal and staid. It was here, in this unfamiliar landscape, that Forrest's true genius for adaptation and relentless execution would be revealed. He established a small factory in the unglamorous industrial town of Slough, a place known more for its grim factories than its culinary delights. It was a Spartan beginning, a far cry from the sprawling facilities he had left behind in Chicago. His first order of business was to adapt his father's creation for the local market. He quickly realized that the American Milky Way was too malty, its chocolate too distinct for British tastes. He reformulated the bar, creating a sweeter, simpler nougat and using a different blend of milk chocolate. He called it simply the Mars Bar. It was an instant success. The British public, hungry for affordable indulgences, embraced the new confection. The Slough factory was soon humming with activity, a small but potent beachhead for Forrest's European ambitions. But Forrest's vision extended far beyond candy bars. He was a restless innovator, constantly scanning the horizon for new opportunities, new markets to disrupt. His most transformative idea came from an unexpected source. He acquired Chappell Brothers, a small, struggling British company that produced canned meat scraps for dogs under the brand name Chappie. At the time, the concept of dedicated pet food was a niche, almost laughable idea. Most people fed their pets table scraps, but Forrest saw something no one else did. He saw the burgeoning trend of humanization, the deep emotional bond people were forming with their companion animals. He believed that people would pay a premium for scientifically formulated high-quality food for their beloved dogs and cats. He threw himself into the pet food business with the same fanatical intensity he applied to confectionery. He applied principles of quality control and branding that were unheard of in the industry. He sourced better ingredients, improved the manufacturing processes, and invested in marketing that emphasized the nutritional benefits of his products. He would later launch iconic brands like Whiskas for cats and Pedigree for dogs. His dedication to quality was legendary. Anecdotes from this period paint a picture of a man possessed. Employees would later recall how Forrest demanded spotless factories and flawless formulas. His obsession with quality bordered on madness. This bizarre, almost comical act was a powerful symbol of his philosophy. It was a demonstration to his employees that quality was not a slogan. It was an obsession that started at the very top. It was during these formative years in Europe that Forrest codified his revolutionary business philosophy, a set of principles that would become the Gospel of Mars, incorporated and would be studied in business schools for decades to come. He called them the 5 principles. First was quality. For Forrest, quality was a non-negotiable obsession. The customer was the ultimate boss, and their satisfaction was paramount. Second was responsibility. This meant taking individual and collective responsibility for results, owning up to failures, and acting with integrity. Third was mutuality. This was perhaps his most radical idea. He believed that a business transaction should yield a mutual benefit for all stakeholders: customers, employees, suppliers, and the community. If you paid your suppliers fairly and on time, they would provide you with the best ingredients. If you paid your employees well above the industry average, they would be more loyal, more productive, and more committed to quality. This mutuality of benefits was the engine of his enterprise. Fourth was efficiency. Forrest despised waste. He saw it as a form of theft from the customer, the company, and the environment. He streamlined his factories, automated processes, and pinched every penny not out of greed, but out of a philosophical commitment to efficiency. The final principle was freedom. As a private company, Mars was free from the tyranny of shareholder demands and the pressure of quarterly earnings reports. This financial freedom allowed the company to make long-term investments and decisions that might not pay off immediately, but were essential for sustainable growth. These 5 principles were not just a plaque on a wall, they were the operating system for his burgeoning empire. But the man who espoused these enlightened ideas was in person a deeply complex and often terrifying figure. He was a tyrant in pursuit of a utopian vision. He managed his factories with an iron fist and an explosive temper. He would stalk the shop floor, his eyes scanning for any imperfection. A speck of dust on a machine, a misaligned wrapper, a worker moving too slowly, any of these could trigger a volcanic eruption of rage. He was notoriously frugal in his personal habits, flying coach, staying in cheap hotels, and working from a Spartan office. He demanded total commitment from his employees, but he rewarded it with salaries and benefits that were the envy of the industry. He created a fiercely loyal, almost cult-like corporate culture. People feared him, but they also respected him. They knew that his impossible standards were the same ones he applied to himself. He was building not just a company, but a machine, an organization fine-tuned for quality and efficiency, all driven by the force of his indomitable will. As the 1930s drew to a close, the clouds of war gathered over Europe. For most businessmen, the looming conflict was a source of immense anxiety. For Forrest Mars, it was a source of inspiration. During the Spanish Civil War, he observed soldiers on the front lines. He noticed a practical problem. In the heat, chocolate, a valuable source of energy and morale, melted into a sticky mess. But he also saw the solution. He watched soldiers eating small pellets of chocolate coated in a hard sugar shell. The British company Rowntree's had a similar product called Smarties. The concept was simple but brilliant. The shell insulated the chocolate from heat and prevented it from melting on the soldier's hands. Forrest immediately grasped the colossal potential of this idea. He envisioned a product that could be included in every soldier's rations, a treat that could withstand the rigors of any climate. He packed his bags and returned to the United States, not to reconcile with his father, but to launch his next great venture. He set up a small office in Newark, New Jersey, and began to develop his new product. But he faced a significant hurdle. With America on the brink of entering World War II, rationing was imminent, and access to key ingredients, especially chocolate, would be severely restricted. He needed a powerful partner. In a move of strategic genius, he approached not a friend, but his chief rival, the Hershey Company. He struck a deal with William Murray, the president of Hershey's. Murray's son, Bruce Murray, became a 20% partner in the new enterprise. In return, Hershey, the undisputed king of American chocolate, would guarantee a steady supply of the essential ingredient. And so, in 1941, M&M Litud was born. The name stood for Mars and Murray. The new candy, small, colorful, button-shaped chocolates, was an immediate success for one simple reason. Forrest sold them almost exclusively to the United States military. M&Ms became a staple in the sea rations of American GIs from the beaches of Normandy to the islands of the Pacific. The slogan, "Melts in your mouth, not in your hand," was not a clever marketing jingle. It was a literal description of the product's primary function. The war served as the greatest marketing campaign in history, introducing millions of young men to the new candy. When they returned home, they brought their taste for M&Ms with them, creating a massive, ready-made civilian market. While Forrest was building his independent empire and revolutionizing the confectionery industry, the American company he had left behind was navigating a period of profound change. In 1934, just 2 years after their acrimonious split, Frank C. Mars died of kidney failure at the age of 50. He never lived to see his son's global triumphs, and their relationship was never repaired. Control of Mars, Incorporated, the company built on the success of the Milky Way and Snickers, passed not to his only son, but to his second wife Ethel V., and her side of the family. For the next 3 decades, two Mars empires existed in parallel. The American company, under the conservative stewardship of Ethel V's family, continued to be profitable but was largely stagnant in terms of innovation. It was a well-run but uninspired enterprise, content to manage the legacy Frank had created. Meanwhile, Forrest Company, Food Manufacturers Incorporated, was a hotbed of creative energy. After the war, he bought out Bruce Murray's share in M&M's, taking full control of his iconic creation. But he wasn't finished innovating. He once again ventured far beyond the world of candy. He learned of a new technology for processing rice, a method called parboiling that had been developed in Britain. The process involves steaming the rice before milling, which forced nutrients from the bran and husk into the starchy endosperm. The resulting rice was more nutritious, more resistant to weevils, and cooked more quickly and consistently. Forrest saw a massive opportunity to create a branded, reliable rice product for the modern American kitchen. He licensed the technology and created the brand Uncle Ben's Converted Rice. To give the brand a face of quality and trustworthiness, he used the image of Frank Brown, a celebrated African-American maitre d' at a Chicago restaurant. Uncle Ben's Rice, like M&M's and Pedigree Pet Food, became another blockbuster success, cementing Forrest's reputation as a visionary who could transform any commodity into a powerhouse brand. For nearly 30 years, Forrest Mars Sr. operated in the shadow of his father's company, a powerful but separate entity. He watched from across the Atlantic and later from his own headquarters in New Jersey, as the company that bore his name was run by his stepfamily. He was the prodigal son, the exiled prince, waiting patiently for his moment to return and claim his birthright. That moment finally came in the early 1960s. After the death of his stepmother, Ethel V., the path was clear. Through a series of shrewd financial maneuvers, he began to consolidate his power. In 1964, the two companies finally merged. Forrest Mars Sr., now a titan of industry in his own right, a billionaire with a global empire built on his own terms, walked back into the offices of the company his father had founded. The reunion was less a joyful reconciliation and more a hostile takeover of corporate culture. The employees of the original Mars Incorporated were accustomed to a more relaxed traditional atmosphere. They were utterly unprepared for the whirlwind of creative destruction that was Forrest Mars. He brought his 5 principles, his explosive temper, and his fanatical obsession with quality and efficiency with him. He tore down the old structures, fired executives he deemed incompetent, and remade the entire organization in his own image. He was finally in control of his father's legacy, and he was determined to purge it of what he saw as decades of complacency. The king had returned from exile, and nothing would ever be the same. When Forrest Mars Sr. seized control of his father's legacy in 1964, it was not a merger of equals, but a conquest. He swept through the comfortable, clubby corridors of the American Mars, incorporated like a revolutionary storm, imposing his austere, fanatically disciplined culture upon a workforce that was utterly unprepared for it. The era of sentimental leadership was over. The era of the machine had begun. The 5 principles, quality, responsibility, mutuality, efficiency, and freedom, were no longer abstract ideals. They were commandments etched in stone. The company was remade from the ground up, transformed into a reflection of one man's indomitable and often terrifying will. He had reclaimed his birthright and in doing so created the most efficient, secretive, and powerful private manufacturing empire the world had ever seen. But even the most relentless revolutionary must eventually plan for succession. Forrest was not just building a company. He was forging a dynasty. His three children, Forrest Jr., John, and Jacqueline, were not raised as the coddled heirs to a vast fortune. They were raised as acolytes in the cult of Mars. Their childhood was a rigorous Spartan training ground designed to strip them of any sense of entitlement and instill in them the same obsessive work ethic that defined their father. While other children of billionaires were enjoying lives of leisure, the Mars children were being taught the value of $1 and the virtue of hard work. Forrest Sr. was notoriously frugal, and he imposed this frugality on his family. They were sent to boarding schools not for prestige, but for discipline. They were expected to work, to prove their worth, to understand the mechanics of the empire, not from a boardroom, but from the factory floor. Their indoctrination into the business was a trial by fire. Forrest Sr. did not believe in nepotism in its traditional sense. His children would inherit the company, but they would have to earn their place at its helm. They started at the bottom, rotating through different divisions of the global enterprise. They worked in accounting, in marketing, on the production lines. John, the second son, famously began his career in the company's Australian pet food division. They were subjected to the same intense scrutiny and impossible standards as every other employee. Their father was their toughest boss, their most unforgiving critic. He was molding them in his own image, ensuring that the principles he had established would survive long after he was gone. He was not just passing on wealth, he was transferring a worldview, a philosophy of business and life that was as rigid and uncompromising as the man himself. As they rose through the ranks, their distinct personalities and roles within the family triad began to emerge. Forrest Jr., the eldest, was the philosopher, the keeper of the flame. He was deeply imbued with his father's principles and saw himself as the custodian of the company's unique culture. Though intensely private by any normal standard, he was the most outwardly focused of his siblings, eventually taking on the role of chairman and occasionally serving as a carefully controlled public face for the anonymous enterprise. John, the middle child, was the true heir to his father's enigmatic and reclusive nature, a brilliant strategist with a mind for numbers and logistics. He was the quiet architect of the company's massive global expansion. He and Forrest Jr. would later share the title of co-president, but it was John who was often seen as the real power behind the throne, a figure of almost mythical secrecy who pulled the strings from deep within the company's inner sanctum. He shunned the spotlight with a fervor that surpassed even his father's, believing that anonymity was the company's greatest strategic asset. Jacqueline, as a woman of her generation, initially had a less direct operational role. However, she was far from a passive heiress. She served on the board for decades. Her influence felt most keenly in the areas of product development and marketing. She possessed a keen understanding of the consumer, a skill that had been central to her grandfather Frank's initial success. She also became the family's most prominent philanthropist, channeling a portion of their immense wealth into educational and cultural institutions. An accomplished equestrian, she carried on the passion for horses that had begun with Frank at Milky Way Farms, a poignant link to the grandfather she barely knew. In 1973, Forrest Mars Sr. officially retired, handing over the reins to his sons. But a man like Forrest never truly retires. He simply finds a new project for his restless energy. He moved to Henderson, Nevada, and in his late 60s started a brand new candy company from scratch. He called it Ethel M. Chocolates, a touching tribute to his mother Elva, whose kitchen lessons had started it all. It was a boutique high-end chocolatier, a stark contrast to the mass-market machine of Mars, Incorporated. It was his way of proving, perhaps mostly to himself, that the old magic was still there. He ran Ethel M. with the same fanatical attention to detail, personally overseeing the recipes and production until he sold it to his son's company in 1988. With Forrest Sr. in retirement, Forrest Jr. and John took full command. Under their leadership, the company entered its most secretive and formidable phase. They moved the corporate headquarters from Chicago to a nondescript, low-slung brick building in a leafy suburb of McLean, Virginia, just a stone's throw from the headquarters of the Central Intelligence Agency. The location was fitting. The building had no sign, no corporate logo, nothing to indicate that it was the nerve center of a multi-billion-dollar global empire. Employees were forbidden from taking photographs. Media inquiries were met with a wall of silence. So impenetrable was its privacy that business journalists and locals nicknamed it the Kremlin. This obsession with secrecy was a multi-layered strategy. On one level, it was a powerful competitive advantage. Rivals like Hershey and Nestlé could only guess at Mars's financial health, its profit margins, or its strategic plans. The company operated like a black box, its inner workings a complete mystery to the outside world. On another, more personal level, it was a security measure. The 1970s was an era of high-profile kidnappings of wealthy heirs, and the Mars family, with their staggering and completely private fortune, would have been a prime target. Anonymity was a shield. But most fundamentally, secrecy was a core tenet of the family's philosophy. Forrest Sr. had drilled into his children the belief that the company's success lay in its products and its principles, not in the personalities of its leaders. They despised the cult of the celebrity CEO, viewing it as a vain and dangerous distraction. The work was what mattered. The family was to remain invisible. Life inside the Kremlin was as unique as the company's public profile. The design of the offices reflected the principle of mutuality. There were no private offices. Everyone, from John and Forrest Jr. down to the newest administrative assistant, sat together in a vast open-plan space. This was intended to break down hierarchies and foster open communication. A time clock, which every employee, including the Mars brothers, had to punch, served as a daily reminder that everyone was an associate, a worker in a shared enterprise. The pay and benefits were famously generous, a continuation of Forrest Sr.'s belief that a well-compensated workforce was a productive and loyal one. But the pressure was immense. The standards were exacting, and the culture was intense. Mars was not just a job. It was a total institution that demanded a level of commitment that bordered on the fanatical. Under the silent, ruthlessly efficient leadership of the third generation, the empire grew to an unprecedented scale. While their father had been the revolutionary innovator, the sons were masters of expansion and execution. They took the machine he had built and scaled it globally with breathtaking speed and precision. They pushed brands like Snickers, M&Ms, and Pedigree into every corner of the globe, adapting marketing and distribution strategies for dozens of different cultures. Their most audacious move came in 2008. In the midst of a global financial crisis, Mars announced its intention to acquire the WBM Wrigley Jr. Company, the world's largest chewing gum manufacturer, for an astonishing $23 billion. It was a colossal gamble, a move that would cement their position as the undisputed global leader in confectionery. To finance the deal, the intensely private family did something they had never done before. They accepted a minority investment from an outsider. That outsider was none other than Warren Buffett, whose Berkshire Hathaway Group helped finance the acquisition. It was a rare, fleeting glimpse into the inner workings of the Mars financial machine, a collaboration of two of the most powerful and respected forces in American business. The deal was a resounding success, adding iconic brands like Juicy Fruit, Double Mint, and Orbit to the Mars portfolio. They also brilliantly expanded on their father's prescient move into pet care. They recognized that for many people, pets were no longer just animals, they were family members. This insight led them to expand beyond pet food and into pet health care. They acquired Banfield Pet Hospitals, the largest chain of veterinary clinics in the United States, often located inside PetSmart stores. They later followed this with the even larger acquisition of VCA Incorporated, another major operator of animal hospitals. This created a powerful, vertically integrated pet health ecosystem. Mars now sold the food that kept pets healthy, and they owned the hospitals that cared for them when they were sick. It was a strategic masterstroke that transformed them into the largest and most influential player in the global pet care industry. But as the empire reached its zenith of power and influence, the shadows that had always lingered at its edges began to lengthen and deepen. The company's impenetrable wall of secrecy, once a strategic asset, was becoming a liability. In a world that was increasingly demanding corporate transparency and social responsibility, Mars's silence was beginning to look like complicity. The issue that would come to haunt the dynasty and tarnish its carefully crafted image was the dark secret at the very beginning of their supply chain, the sourcing of their cocoa. The chocolate industry's dirty secret was blown wide open in 2001 when a series of damning reports and documentaries exposed the widespread use of child labor and, in some cases, outright slavery on the cocoa farms of West Africa, particularly in the Ivory Coast and Ghana, where the majority of the world's cocoa is grown. The reports painted a horrifying picture. Children, some as young as 7 or 8, trafficked from neighboring countries, forced to work long hours under brutal conditions, using dangerous tools like machetes, and denied any chance of an education. Faced with a public relations nightmare and the threat of consumer boycotts, the world's largest chocolate companies, including Mars, Hershey, and Nestlé, were hauled before the U.S. Congress. To stave off binding legislation, they signed a voluntary agreement known as the Harkin-Engel Protocol. In it, they publicly pledged to eradicate the worst forms of child labor from their supply chains by 2005. It was a landmark moment, a public promise from a notoriously secretive industry to clean up its act. But the 2005 deadline came and went, with little discernible progress. A new deadline was set for 2008, and then another for 2010. Each time, the industry, including Mars, issued statements acknowledging the complexity of the problem. They pointed to the millions of small independent farms, the endemic poverty that forced families to put their children to work, and the challenges of monitoring a vast and fragmented supply chain in politically unstable regions. They began to invest in sustainability programs, partnering with organizations like the Rainforest Alliance and Fairtrade, and launching their own initiatives to support farming communities. Yet, investigative journalists and human rights organizations continued to find the same horrific conditions on the ground. A major 2019 investigation by the Washington Post found that, despite nearly 2 decades of promises and hundreds of millions of dollars spent by the industry, the problem of child labor in West Africa was not only persistent, but may have actually gotten worse. In a moment of shocking candor that same year, a Mars executive admitted that the company could not guarantee that its chocolate was free from child labor. After 18 years of pledges, it was a devastating admission of failure. The issue eventually reached the highest court in the United States. A lawsuit was brought against Nestlé and Cargill by a group of former child slaves from Mali who claimed they had been trafficked to the Ivory Coast and forced to work on cocoa farms. The case, brought against Nestlé and Cargill, exposed the industry's systemic ties to child labor, casting a long shadow over every chocolate giant, including Mars. In 2021, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the corporations. The legal reasoning was technical but devastating for the plaintiffs. The court determined that the decisions made by executives in the U.S. did not have a direct enough causal link to the abuses happening thousands of miles away to hold the companies legally liable under the Alien Tort Statute. It was a legal victory for the industry, but a profound moral defeat. For the Mars family, the silent dynasty that had always controlled its own narrative, the cocoa controversy was a crisis of identity. It struck at the heart of their most cherished principle, mutuality. How could a company that prided itself on creating a mutuality of benefits for all its stakeholders preside over a supply chain that exploited the most vulnerable people in it? The third generation, Forrest Jr., John, and Jacqueline, had masterfully expanded their father's empire, turning it into a global colossus of unprecedented scale. But they had also inherited its original sin. As they prepared to pass the torch to a fourth generation, they were handing over not just a fantastically profitable and powerful company, but also its most profound and unresolved ethical dilemma. The Empire of Shadows had a secret it could no longer keep. The death of Forrest Mars Jr. in 2016 was more than just a passing. It was the end of an era. It marked the symbolic twilight of the third generation, the silent rulers who had transformed their father's formidable company into a global colossus. With his brother John and sister Jacqueline advancing into their 80s and stepping back from the day-to-day running of the empire, the mantle of leadership was passing to a new generation. The fourth generation of the Mars dynasty was stepping out of the shadows to inherit not only one of the world's largest private companies, but also its decades of deeply ingrained secrets and its most profound moral crisis. They were taking the helm in a world their ancestors would scarcely recognize, a world of relentless connectivity, of digital transparency, where the secrets guarded so fiercely for a century were becoming impossible and undesirable to keep. The new leaders, figures like Jacqueline's son Stephen Badger, who served as chairman, and Forrest Jr.'s daughter Victoria B. Mars, were a different breed. They were not revolutionaries like their grandfather, nor were they silent sovereigns like their parents. They were pragmatists, shaped by an interconnected world where corporate reputation is fragile and consumer trust is paramount. They understood that the fortress of secrecy their family had built, the infamous Kremlin in McLean, was no longer a strategic asset, but a liability. In an age of social media and citizen journalism, silence was no longer interpreted as strength, but as suspicion. To attract the best and brightest new talent, millennials and Gen Z, who demanded that their employers have a social conscience, Mars had to have a story to tell. To win the loyalty of modern consumers, they had to be more than just a brand. They had to stand for something. Beginning around 2018, the Great Thaw began. It was not a sudden, dramatic throwing open of the gates, but a slow, calculated, and carefully managed pivot towards a new era of openness. The company launched a slick new corporate website, began publishing detailed sustainability reports, and allowed its senior executives to give carefully vetted interviews. Stephen Badger, as chairman, became a far more public figure than any Mars family member before him. He spoke at conferences, engaged with the media, and began to articulate a new vision for the company, one that acknowledged its past shortcomings and outlined a path forward. This was not a confession, it was a strategic rebranding. It was a recognition that in the 21st century, controlling the narrative meant participating in it. The fourth generation understood that if they did not tell their own story, their critics, the journalists, the activists, the human rights organizations would be more than happy to tell it for them. The most urgent task for this new generation of leadership was to confront the company's original sin, the cocoa controversy. The decades of broken promises and damning exposés had left a deep stain on the Mars name. The new strategy was to move from a defensive crouch to a proactive, public-facing approach. In 2018, they launched their most ambitious sustainability plan to date, a program called Cocoa for Generations. It was backed by a headline-grabbing commitment of $1 billion over 10 years. The plan was a tacit admission that their previous efforts had been insufficient and that a more radical approach was needed. At the heart of the Cocoa for Generations plan were two key pillars. The first was a renewed and urgent focus on traceability. For years, the company's inability to trace the majority of its cocoa back to the specific farms where it was grown was the central flaw in its ethical argument. If you didn't know where your cocoa was coming from, you couldn't possibly know if it was being produced with child labor. Mars set an audacious goal to source 100% of its cocoa from traceable and sustainably managed farms by 2025. This involved a massive technological undertaking using GPS to map tens of thousands of small farms, collecting data on their output and creating a digital supply chain that would, in theory, allow them to follow a batch of cocoa beans from a specific village in Ghana all the way to a factory in Chicago. The second and more revolutionary pillar was a direct acknowledgement that poverty was the root cause of child labor. The company began to publicly advocate for higher incomes for farmers, a significant shift from the industry's historical focus on simply paying the fluctuating market price. They began investing in programs to help farmers improve their crop yields and diversify their income streams. More importantly, they engaged with the governments of Ivory Coast and Ghana, who in 2019 took the bold step of instituting a living income differential, a mandatory premium of $400 per ton on all cocoa sales, designed to lift farmers out of poverty. While the implementation of the LID has been complex and fraught with challenges, Mars's public support for the initiative signaled a fundamental change in their thinking. They also revamped their approach to tackling child labor on the ground. Instead of relying on flawed certification schemes that often failed to detect abuses, they began to implement a more robust system known as Child Labor Monitoring and Remediation, CLMRS. This system actively seeks to identify children at risk, and when a case is found, it provides direct support and remediation, working with local communities to get children enrolled in school, providing resources to their families, and addressing the underlying issues that led to the child being put to work in the first place. These efforts have not gone unnoticed. In recent chocolate scorecards and annual ranking of the industry's ethical performance, Mars has often received a yellow rating, signifying that it is starting to implement good policies. It is now frequently ranked ahead of some of its major competitors. However, watchdog groups and critics remain deeply skeptical. They argue that progress is far too slow. They point out that the 2025 traceability goal is almost certain to be missed, and they contend that despite the new initiatives, The fundamental power imbalance in the cocoa industry remains. The price paid to farmers is still largely dictated by a handful of massive corporations, and it is still not enough to guarantee a true living wage for millions of families. The shadow of exploitation, while perhaps fainter than it once was, has not disappeared. The company is taking steps, but the journey towards a truly ethical supply chain is still a long and arduous one. While grappling with its most profound ethical challenge, the modern Mars empire has continued to evolve and expand in directions that would have astounded its founder. The company that began with a single buttercream candy is now a sprawling, diversified conglomerate whose identity is no longer solely defined by confectionery. The business is now broadly organized into several major divisions: Mars Wrigley, which houses the iconic candy brands, Mars Food and Nutrition, and the colossal Mars Pet Care. For many observers, the most surprising fact about the modern company is that the pet care division is now its largest and fastest growing segment, with revenues that eclipse those of its famous candy business. The acquisitions of Banfield and VCA have made Mars the single largest employer of veterinarians in the world. The company's future, it seems, may have more to do with puppies and kittens than with chocolate bars. This evolution is also reflected in their response to shifting cultural tides. In 2020, in the wake of the global protests for racial justice, the company made a landmark decision. They announced they would be rebranding Uncle Ben's Rice, a brand developed by Mars after World War II based on Forrest Sr.'s rice processing innovation, to Ben's Original. They also removed the image of Frank Brown, the African-American maitre d', whose face had adorned the box for over 70 years. The company acknowledged that the brand's origins were rooted in racial stereotypes and that it was time for a change. It was a decision that would have been unthinkable under the old guard, a clear signal that the fourth generation was willing to critically examine its own history and adapt to the values of a new era. They are no longer just a manufacturing company. They are a modern global brand, navigating the complex cross-currents of social and political change. In the end, what does the story of the Mars family leave behind? This is an epic tale of ambition, innovation, and conflict. The story begins with Frank Mars, who transformed the adversity of illness into the sweet American dream. It was continued by his son Forrest Mars Sr., a ruthless genius who built a global machine, but was willing to destroy family bonds to achieve his goals. The third generation, Forrest Jr., John, and Jacqueline, were the silent rulers. They took the empire to unimaginable heights while shielding it behind a near absolute veil of secrecy. And now the fourth generation faces a world that demands transparency, where the family's darkest secrets, especially the issue of child labor, can no longer be hidden. The story of Mars is one of profound paradox, the contrast between sweet and bitter, between the joy their products bring and the harsh, often exploitative realities behind how they are made. So the next time you open a Snickers bar, remember you're not just holding a piece of candy. You're holding a century of family tragedy, breathtaking innovation, and piercing ethical questions that still demand answers.